Crash course on the Tiananmen Massacre. Why did China Communist Party, CPP, kill the democracy? The Tiananmen Massacre was a violent crackdown by the Chinese government on pro-democracy protesters in Tiananmen Square in Beijing on June 4, 1989. The protesters had been calling for political reform and greater freedom of speech, but the Chinese government responded with force, leading to the deaths of hundreds or possibly thousands of people. Background. In the late 1980s, China was going through a period of rapid economic growth, but there was also growing dissatisfaction with the Communist Party's one-party rule and lack of political freedom. In April 1989, thousands of students and other citizens began gathering in Tiananmen Square to demand political reform, freedom of speech, and an end to corruption. The protests grew in size and spread to other cities in China, and the government declared martial law in May. Events of the massacre. On the night of June 3, 1989, the Chinese government mobilized troops and tanks to clear the protesters from Tiananmen Square. The soldiers used tear gas and batons to disperse the crowds, but when the protesters refused to leave, the military opened fire. Eyewitnesses reported that the soldiers fired indiscriminately into the crowds, killing and injuring many unarmed civilians. Aftermath. The Chinese government quickly arrested and imprisoned thousands of people who had participated in the protests, including students, intellectuals, and journalists. The government also imposed strict censorship on the media and public discourse, and cracked down on any signs of dissent or opposition. Reasons for the crackdown. There were several reasons why the Chinese government decided to use force to quell the protests. Fear of losing control. The Chinese government saw the pro-democracy protests as a threat to its one-party rule and feared that the protests would spread and lead to greater social instability. Ideological differences. The Chinese government saw the pro-democracy movement as a challenge to its Marxist-Leninist ideology and the legitimacy of the Communist Party. International pressure. The Chinese government was also facing increasing pressure from Western governments and media outlets to adopt more democratic reforms, which it saw as interference in its internal affairs. Power struggle within the government. There were also divisions within the Chinese government over how to respond to the protests, with some officials advocating for dialogue and compromise, while others favored a hardline approach. Interesting stories and examples. 1. The Tank Man. One of the most iconic images from the Tiananmen Massacre is the photograph of a lone protester standing in front of a column of tanks. The man, whose identity is still unknown, was trying to stop the tanks from advancing towards Tiananmen Square. The image has become a symbol of peaceful resistance and defiance against oppression. 2. The Goddess of Democracy. The protesters erected a large statue in Tiananmen Square called the Goddess of Democracy, which was meant to symbolize their aspirations for greater political freedom and democracy. The statue was destroyed by the Chinese government during the crackdown. 3. The legacy of Tiananmen. The Chinese government has gone to great lengths to suppress any discussion or commemoration of the Tiananmen Massacre, and many Chinese citizens today are unaware of what happened. However, the event has had a lasting impact on Chinese society and politics, and has become a symbol of the struggle for democracy and human rights in China. 4. Global reactions. The Tiananmen Massacre had a significant impact on international relations, with many Western countries condemning the Chinese government's use of force and imposing economic sanctions. The event also had a lasting impact on China's relations with the United States, with President George H.W. Bush's administration condemning the crackdown and imposing restrictions on arms sales to China. 5. Student leaders. Many of the student leaders who organized the protests in Tiananmen Square were arrested and imprisoned after the crackdown. Some, like Wang Dan and Chai Ling, were eventually released and went into exile, where they continued to advocate for democracy and human rights in China. 6. Censorship. The Chinese government has imposed strict censorship on any discussion of the Tiananmen Massacre, and the event is largely unknown to many younger Chinese citizens who have grown up in a climate of government control over information. 7. China today. Today, China remains a one-party state with limited political freedom, and the government continues to suppress any signs of dissent or opposition. However, China has also become a global economic powerhouse, and its rise as a superpower has challenged the existing world order. 8. Historical significance. The Tiananmen Massacre is a significant event in modern Chinese history, and it has become a symbol of the struggle for democracy and human rights in China. The event has also had a lasting impact on China's relationship with the rest of the world, and it remains a sensitive and taboo topic in Chinese society today. 9. The unknown toll. The Chinese government has never released an official death toll from the Tiananmen Massacre, and estimates vary widely. Some human rights groups estimate that thousands of people may have been killed, while the Chinese government maintains that only a few dozen people died. 10. Remembering the victims. Despite the government's efforts to suppress any commemoration of the Tiananmen Massacre, there are still individuals and groups in China and around the world who remember and honor the victims. Every year on June 4, people around the world hold vigils and protests to remember the victims and call for greater political freedom and democracy in China. Here were leaders during this movement. 1. Chai Ling, a student leader who helped organize the protests in Tiananmen Square and later went into exile in the United States. 2. Wang Dan, a student leader who became one of the most visible faces of the pro-democracy movement in China. He was arrested and imprisoned after the Tiananmen crackdown, but was eventually released and went into exile in the United States. 3. Wu Kaishi, a student leader who became famous for his confrontation with Premier Li Peng during a televised meeting. He fled China after the crackdown and now lives in Taiwan. 4. Feng Kanj, a student leader who helped organize the protests in Tiananmen Square and went into exile in France after the crackdown. 5. Li Lu, a student leader who played a key role in organizing the protests in Tiananmen Square and later went into exile in the United States. 6. Bao Tong, a high-ranking Communist Party official who was sympathetic to the pro-democracy movement and was subsequently arrested and imprisoned after the crackdown. 7. Fang Lizhi, a prominent astrophysicist and activist who became one of the most vocal critics of the Communist Party and was forced to flee China after the crackdown. 8. Liu Xiaobo, a writer and intellectual who became a leading voice for political reform in China. He was arrested and imprisoned after the Tiananmen crackdown and later went on to win the Nobel Peace Prize in 2010. 9. Ding Zilin, a retired professor who became an advocate for the families of those killed in the Tiananmen Massacre. 10. Han Dongfang, a former railway worker who became a labor activist and played a key role in organizing the protests in Tiananmen Square. 11. Zhang Boli, a student leader who became a prominent voice for democracy and human rights in China. He fled to the United States after the crackdown. 12. Zhou Duo, a writer and intellectual who helped organize the protests in Tiananmen Square and was subsequently arrested and imprisoned after the crackdown. He was eventually released and went into exile in the United States. In conclusion, the Tiananmen Massacre remains a tragic and significant event in modern Chinese history, representing a brutal crackdown on peaceful protests for political reform and freedom of speech. The event had a lasting impact on China's relationship with the rest of the world and has become a symbol of the struggle for democracy and human rights in China. Despite the government's efforts to suppress any discussion or commemoration of the event, the memory of the victims lives on and serves as a reminder of the importance of free speech and democratic values. Here is a poem on the Tiananmen Massacre. In Tiananmen Square, a sea of dreams. The people gathered, hopeful it seems. A call for change, for democracy. Their voices ringing out for all to see. The students stood, young and brave, determined to see their country saved. They called for rights, for a better way, for freedom to speak and have their say. But the government, afraid of change, responded with violence, a brutal exchange. The tanks rolled in, the guns did fire, and dreams were shattered in the bloody mire. The square was stained with blood and tears, as the people faced their darkest fears. The world watched on in shock and awe, as the government ignored their call. The students fell, one by one, their dreams of change forever done. But their memory lives on, in hearts and minds, a symbol of hope, for all of humankind. The Tiananmen Massacre, a tragic day, a reminder of the price we pay, for the right to speak and have a voice. to stand for justice and make a choice. May we never forget the lives lost, the dreams crushed, the line crossed. And may we always stand for what is right, to keep their memory burning bright. Start planning your next global adventure with ease and convenience with our Booking.com referral link. https://www.booking.com/index.html $8 = 79893335 as a great choice to plan your next trip. You can find and book flights, hotels, cars, and local attractions all in one place, and their price match guarantee ensures you're getting the best deal. Thank you for kind support our AnHub Metaverse channel, and please watch more interesting videos here.